Princess Isabella stood before the grand mirror in her chambers, watching her lady-in-waiting adjust the sapphire necklace around her neck. The jewels felt heavier than usual tonight, pressing against her throat like a gentle reminder of the weight she carried on her shoulders. Tonight was the annual harvest banquet, the most important social event in the kingdom of Aurelia, and she was expected to be the perfect picture of royal grace. "Your Highness, you look absolutely radiant," Lady Margaret said, stepping back to admire her work. The princess wore a gown of midnight blue silk that cascaded to the floor like a waterfall, embedded with tiny crystals that caught the candlelight and sparkled like stars. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant arrangement with delicate tendrils framing her face. Isabella managed a weak smile in the mirror's reflection. What Lady Margaret couldn't see was the exhaustion that had been building for weeks. The princess had been working tirelessly to organize relief efforts for the drought-stricken northern provinces, often staying up until dawn reviewing supply lists and correspondence with local governors. She had barely eaten that day, surviving on nothing but tea and nervous energy. "Thank you, Margaret," she whispered, her voice softer than intended. "I suppose we should make our way to the Great Hall." The corridors of the palace buzzed with activity as servants hurried past carrying trays of delicacies and fresh flowers. The sound of musicians tuning their instruments drifted from the banquet hall, mixing with the chatter of early arriving guests. Isabella walked slowly, one hand trailing along the stone wall for support, though she disguised it as casual elegance. As they approached the massive oak doors of the great hall, Isabella could hear the excited voices of hundreds of nobles, dignitaries, and foreign ambassadors. This banquet was not just a celebration, but a crucial diplomatic gathering where trade agreements would be discussed and political alliances strengthened. Her presence was not optional, it was essential. "Princess, the herald is ready to announce your arrival," a palace guard informed her, bowing deeply. Isabella took a deep breath, feeling her corset suddenly seem too tight around her ribs. She nodded gracefully and waited for the trumpets to sound. The massive doors swung open, and the herald's voice boomed across the hall. "Her Royal Highness, Princess Isabella of Aurelia." The great hall fell silent as hundreds of eyes turned toward her. The room was magnificent, with towering columns draped in golden fabric, crystal chandeliers casting warm light over round tables laden with the finest china and silver. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted meats, fresh bread, and exotic spices from distant lands. Isabella began her descent down the marble staircase, her silk slippers barely making a sound. She smiled and nodded to familiar faces, her training allowing her to maintain perfect posture despite the growing dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. The applause was thunderous, but it seemed to come from very far away. Halfway down the stairs, she spotted Prince Alexander of Valdres standing near the head table. He was impossibly handsome in his military dress uniform, with broad shoulders and kind eyes that seemed to find hers across the crowded room. They had been introduced several months ago during a state visit, and since then there had been subtle hints from both kingdoms about a possible marriage alliance. Alexander had been nothing but respectful and charming during their previous encounters. Unlike other suitors who seemed more interested in her crown than her thoughts, he actually listened when she spoke about her concerns for the kingdom's welfare. He had even offered assistance from his own kingdom's resources for the drought relief efforts. As Isabella continued down the staircase, she felt her vision begin to blur slightly around the edges. The combination of hunger, exhaustion, and the overwhelming heat from hundreds of bodies in the enclosed space was beginning to take its toll. She gripped the marble banister more tightly, her knuckles turning white beneath her silk gloves. The crowd of nobles parted respectfully as she reached the bottom of the stairs, creating a pathway toward the head table where her parents, the king and queen, waited to welcome their guests. Isabella forced herself to maintain her graceful stride, even though each step felt like she was walking through thick honey. "Your Highness," came a warm, familiar voice to her left. Prince Alexander had approached and offered her his arm in a gesture of courtesy. "May I have the honor of escorting you to your table?" Isabella looked up at him, grateful for the unexpected support. His presence seemed to steady her somehow, though she was careful not to lean too heavily on his arm. "Of course, Your Highness. How thoughtful of you." As they walked together toward the head table, Alexander leaned closer and spoke in a low voice meant only for her ears. "Are you feeling well, Princess? You seem a bit pale tonight." His genuine concern caught her off guard. Most people at court were so focused on appearances and protocol that they rarely noticed if someone was actually struggling. She appreciated his attentiveness, but royal training had taught her to never show weakness in public. "I am perfectly fine. Thank you for asking," she replied automatically, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Perhaps just a bit tired from the preparations for tonight's event." Alexander didn't look entirely convinced, but he respected her answer and simply adjusted his pace to match her slightly slower steps. His steady presence beside her was more comforting than she had expected, and she found herself genuinely grateful for his company. The head table was positioned on a raised platform, giving the royal family a clear view of all their guests while allowing them to be seen by everyone in attendance. As they approached, Isabella could see her parents engaged in animated conversation with several foreign ambassadors, their faces bright with diplomatic smiles. King Ferdinand looked distinguished in his formal robes of state, while Queen Catherine wore a gown of deep emerald that complemented the family's ceremonial crown jewels. They both turned as Isabella and Alexander approached, their expressions warm but expectant. "Isabella, my dear, you look absolutely stunning tonight," Queen Catherine said, rising to embrace her daughter. "And Prince Alexander, how wonderful to see you again. We are so pleased you could join us for this special evening." "The pleasure is entirely mine, Your Majesty," Alexander replied, bowing respectfully. "Princess Isabella has been kind enough to share her insights about the evening's festivities." As the formalities continued, Isabella felt the room beginning to spin slightly. The countless candles seemed to flicker more intensely, and the voices around her started to sound muffled and distant. She pressed her lips together and concentrated on breathing steadily, hoping the feeling would pass quickly. The evening's program included several courses of elaborate dishes, entertainment by renowned musicians and dancers, and speeches by various dignitaries. Isabella knew she would be expected to participate in conversations, sample each course politely, and possibly even dance with several important guests. The thought of enduring several more hours in her current state felt overwhelming. "Shall we take our seats?" King Ferdinand suggested, gesturing toward the ornate chairs arranged around the head table. "I believe our guests are eager to begin the feast." Isabella nodded and allowed Alexander to pull out her chair, grateful for the opportunity to sit down. The carved wooden seat was cushioned with velvet, and for a moment she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Perhaps she could manage the evening after all if she could just rest periodically. As the first course was served, Isabella tried to focus on the conversations flowing around her. The topics ranged from harvest reports to trade negotiations, with occasional mentions of artistic achievements and cultural exchanges between kingdoms. She contributed when directly addressed, but mostly listened, using her energy carefully. Alexander, seated to her right, seemed to understand instinctively that she needed space to recover. He engaged actively with other guests, drawing attention away from her while still remaining close enough to offer assistance if needed. His thoughtfulness did not go unnoticed, though Isabella was too exhausted to fully appreciate it in the moment. The second course arrived with great fanfare as servants presented platters of honey-glazed duck, roasted vegetables, and delicate pastries shaped like flowers. The aroma was divine, but Isabella found herself unable to take more than a few small bites. Her stomach felt queasy, and the rich flavors that normally delighted her now seemed overwhelming. She lifted her crystal goblet of wine to her lips, hoping the cool liquid might help settle her nerves, but even that felt too heavy in her trembling hands. Across the table, she could see various nobles engaged in animated discussions about trade routes and military alliances, their faces flushed with good wine and excitement. "Princess Isabella," called Lord Hampton, an elderly diplomat from the neighboring kingdom of Westmere. "We were just discussing the remarkable success of your drought relief program. I understand you personally oversaw the distribution strategies?" All eyes at the head table turned toward her, waiting expectantly for her response. Isabella felt her heart rate quicken as she struggled to focus on his words. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. "Yes, Lord Hampton," she managed, her voice sounding distant even to her own ears. "We worked closely with local administrators to ensure supplies reached the most affected communities. The cooperation between our kingdoms has been truly remarkable." She paused, feeling beads of perspiration forming along her hairline despite the cool evening air. The elaborate hairstyle that had taken hours to create now felt like it was pulling painfully at her scalp, and the heavy necklace seemed to be restricting her breathing. Prince Alexander, who had been listening to the conversation while keeping a discreet eye on Isabella, noticed the slight tremor in her voice. He leaned forward slightly, drawing Lord Hampton's attention to himself. "Princess Isabella's leadership in that crisis was truly inspiring," Alexander interjected smoothly. "I had the opportunity to observe some of the relief operations firsthand during my recent visit, and the level of organization was remarkable. Perhaps Lord Hampton would be interested in hearing about the innovative transportation methods we employed?" Isabella shot him a grateful glance as he skillfully redirected the conversation away from her. His quick thinking allowed her a few moments to collect herself while he engaged the other guests with detailed accounts of supply chain logistics and coordination between kingdoms. As Alexander spoke, Isabella tried to focus on his voice, using it as an anchor in the increasingly surreal atmosphere around her. His words were clear and confident, and she found herself admiring not just his diplomatic skills, but his genuine understanding of the relief efforts. Unlike many nobles who spoke about such matters in vague, theoretical terms, Alexander demonstrated real knowledge of the practical challenges they had faced. The musicians began playing a lively melody, and several guests started clapping along with the rhythm. The sound seemed unnaturally loud to Isabella, bouncing off the stone walls and creating an almost overwhelming cacophony. She pressed her fingers against her temples, trying to massage away the headache that was building behind her eyes. "Your Highness, are you enjoying the entertainment?" asked Lady Vivian, a young noblewoman from the eastern provinces who was seated across from Isabella. "The musicians are absolutely wonderful tonight. I believe they've come all the way from the southern kingdom specifically for this occasion." Isabella lifted her head and attempted to smile, but the effort felt enormous. The musicians' colorful costumes seemed to blur together as they swayed with their instruments, creating a dizzying kaleidoscope of motion and sound. She blinked several times, trying to clear her vision. "Yes, they're quite talented," she replied, though her words came out slower than intended. "The music is lovely." Queen Catherine, who had been engaged in conversation with foreign ambassadors, suddenly turned her attention to her daughter. Her maternal instincts were finely tuned after years of watching Isabella navigate the pressures of royal life, and something in her daughter's posture raised immediate concern. "Isabella, dear, you look a bit warm," the Queen observed, her voice carrying just the right mix of casual concern and royal authority. "Perhaps some fresh air would be beneficial. The palace gardens are particularly beautiful in the moonlight tonight." Isabella recognized her mother's subtle offer as an escape route, but she also knew that leaving the banquet prematurely would raise questions and possibly cause diplomatic embarrassment. Too many important guests had traveled great distances specifically to attend this event, and her absence would not go unnoticed. "I appreciate the suggestion, Mother, but I wouldn't want to miss any of the evening's presentations," Isabella replied, though the effort of speaking was becoming more difficult. "I'm sure the feeling will pass." Prince Alexander, who had been listening to this exchange while maintaining his conversation with Lord Hampton, felt a growing sense of alarm. Throughout the evening, he had watched Isabella's color gradually drain from her cheeks, and now he could see tiny beads of perspiration glistening on her forehead despite the comfortable temperature in the hall. The third course was presented with even more elaborate ceremony, featuring dishes prepared by the kingdom's most celebrated chefs: roasted peacock with exotic fruit glazes, delicate soufflés that rose like golden clouds, and intricate sugar sculptures that looked like miniature palaces graced the tables. The presentation was breathtaking, but Isabella felt her appetite disappearing entirely. She picked up her fork and attempted to take a small bite of the glazed vegetables, but even chewing seemed to require enormous effort. The flavors that should have been delightful tasted flat and unappetizing. She set down her utensils and reached for her water goblet, hoping that clear liquid might be easier to manage. As she lifted the goblet, her hand trembled noticeably, causing the water to slosh slightly against the crystal rim. The sound seemed impossibly loud to her ears, and she was certain that everyone at the table must have noticed. She set the goblet down quickly, perhaps too quickly, and the action caused a small splash onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Oh, forgive me," she murmured, dabbing at the spot with her napkin. The simple task of cleaning up the minor spill felt overwhelming, and she found herself moving much more slowly than normal. King Ferdinand, who had been discussing grain exports with a merchant delegation, noticed his daughter's distress. His weathered face showed immediate concern, but years of royal training had taught him to handle such situations with discretion. "Perhaps we should proceed to the dancing portion of the evening," he suggested to the assembled guests. "The musicians have prepared some delightful pieces, and I know our younger guests are eager to showcase their skills." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic approval from many of the attendees, particularly the younger nobles who had been sitting politely through the lengthy dinner courses. As servants began clearing the tables and rearranging the furniture to create space for dancing, Isabella felt a new wave of panic wash over her. Dancing required energy, balance, and concentration, none of which she felt capable of providing in her current state. The thought of being spun around the dance floor while hundreds of people watched made her feel even more dizzy than she already was. Prince Alexander stood and offered his hand to Isabella, his eyes meeting hers with an expression of quiet understanding. "Princess, would you do me the honor of the first dance?" Isabella looked up at him, seeing not just courtesy but genuine concern in his gaze. She knew that accepting his invitation would mean standing up, moving to the center of the great hall, and performing a complex dance routine while feeling like she might collapse at any moment. But she also knew that refusing would create a diplomatic incident and draw even more attention to her condition. "I would be delighted," she replied, though her voice was barely above a whisper. She placed her hand in his, noting how steady and warm his fingers felt compared to her own cold, trembling ones. As she attempted to rise from her chair, the room suddenly tilted dramatically, and she felt herself swaying backward. Prince Alexander's grip on her hand tightened instinctively, providing the support she desperately needed. "Take your time," he murmured quietly, his words meant only for her. "There's no rush." Isabella stood slowly, grateful for his patient assistance. The floor felt unsteady beneath her feet, as if she were standing on the deck of a ship in rough seas. She took a deep breath and attempted to take a step toward the dance floor, but her legs felt weak and unreliable. The other guests had begun to gather around the edges of the great hall, creating a circle that would showcase the dancing couples. Isabella could see their faces, bright with anticipation and wine, all turned expectantly toward her and Alexander. The pressure of their collective attention felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. As the musicians struck the opening notes of a traditional waltz, Prince Alexander guided Isabella toward the center of the great hall. Each step felt like an enormous challenge for the princess, but she drew on every ounce of royal training to maintain her composure. The elaborate gown that had looked so beautiful earlier now felt impossibly heavy, and the jeweled slippers seemed to catch on the marble floor. The gathered nobles formed a wide circle around them, their faces glowing with anticipation. Isabella could hear murmurs of appreciation for her gown and compliments about what a handsome couple she and Alexander made together. Under normal circumstances, such attention would have filled her with confidence, but tonight it only amplified her growing sense of panic. Alexander placed his hand gently on her waist and took her right hand in his left, assuming the traditional dancing position. His touch was respectful but firm, and Isabella found herself grateful for his steady presence. As they began to move in time with the music, she tried to focus on the familiar steps she had practiced countless times in her youth. The waltz started slowly, with simple movements that allowed dancers to find their rhythm together. Alexander was an excellent partner, leading with confidence while remaining attentive to Isabella's needs. He could feel the tension in her frame and the slight trembling that she was trying so hard to conceal. "Just focus on my eyes," he whispered softly as they turned together. "Ignore everyone else. It's just you and me and the music." Isabella looked up at him, finding surprising comfort in his calm, reassuring gaze. His eyes were a warm brown, flecked with gold that caught the candlelight. For a moment she felt some of her anxiety ease as she concentrated on his face rather than the crowd of watching guests. They moved together gracefully, Alexander adjusting his steps to accommodate Isabella's slightly slower pace. To the observers, they looked like a perfectly matched couple, elegant and poised. No one could see the effort it was taking Isabella to maintain each movement, or how Alexander was subtly supporting more of her weight than was traditional in ballroom dancing. As the music swelled, the dance called for more complex movements, including turns that would showcase the princess's gown to its full advantage. Alexander sensed Isabella's growing fatigue and modified the choreography slightly, choosing simpler variations that would still look impressive to the watching crowd. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured during a brief pause in the melody. "Just a little longer." Isabella tried to smile at his encouragement, but she could feel her strength ebbing away with each passing moment. The room seemed to be growing warmer despite the cool evening air flowing through the open windows. Her vision began to blur around the edges, and she found it increasingly difficult to focus on Alexander's face. The musicians increased the tempo for the final section of the waltz, and the other couples who had joined them on the dance floor began to move with greater energy and flourish. Alexander kept Isabella's movements deliberately restrained, but even the modified steps were becoming too much for her weakened state. As they approached the climactic final turn of the dance, Isabella felt the world suddenly tilt violently around her. The faces of the watching nobles became a blur of colors and shapes, and the sound of the music seemed to fade into the distance. Her legs, which had been trembling throughout the dance, finally began to give way beneath her. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music. "I don't think I can—" Before she could finish the sentence, Isabella felt her knees buckle completely. Her vision went dark around the edges, and she began to fall backward, her heavy gown pulling her toward the marble floor. The last thing she registered was the collective gasp from the assembled guests and the sudden silence as the musicians stopped playing. Prince Alexander's reflexes were lightning quick. The moment he felt Isabella's weight shift and her hand go limp in his, he moved instinctively to catch her. His right arm swept around her waist, pulling her against his chest, while his left hand supported her shoulders. Instead of hitting the cold marble floor, Isabella found herself cradled safely in his strong embrace. The great hall erupted in concerned voices as nobles pressed closer to see what had happened. Alexander ignored the commotion completely, his attention focused entirely on the unconscious princess in his arms. Her face had gone completely pale, and her breathing was shallow but steady. "Step back, please," King Ferdinand commanded as he rushed toward his daughter, his royal authority cutting through the crowd like a sword. "Give her space to breathe." Queen Catherine was immediately at her husband's side, her maternal instincts overriding all protocol. She knelt beside Alexander, who had carefully lowered Isabella until she was sitting on the floor with her back supported against his chest. "Has someone called for the royal physician?" the Queen demanded, her voice tight with worry. "Already done, Your Majesty," replied Captain Morris, the head of the Royal Guard, who had appeared seemingly from nowhere. "Dr. Whitmore is on his way." Alexander continued to hold Isabella gently, one hand supporting her head, while the other maintained a protective arm around her shoulders. Her elaborate hairstyle had come partially undone during the collapse, and dark tendrils framed her pale face. Even unconscious, she maintained an ethereal beauty that made several of the watching ladies sigh with sympathy. "Princess Isabella, can you hear me?" Alexander spoke softly, his voice filled with genuine concern rather than mere diplomatic politeness. Isabella's eyelids fluttered slightly, and she made a small sound that might have been an attempt to respond. Alexander felt relief wash over him as he saw signs that she was beginning to regain consciousness. Dr. Whitmore arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand and his gray hair disheveled from having been summoned so urgently. The elderly physician had served the royal family for over 20 years and had seen Isabella through various childhood illnesses and injuries. "What happened?" he asked briskly, kneeling beside the group on the marble floor. "She collapsed during the waltz," Alexander explained. "She's been looking unwell all evening, but she insisted she was fine." Dr. Whitmore nodded grimly as he began his examination, checking Isabella's pulse and breathing while asking quick questions about her recent eating and sleeping habits. The answers painted a clear picture of exhaustion and dehydration brought on by weeks of overwork and stress. "She needs rest, proper nutrition, and quiet," the doctor pronounced after a few minutes. "This is what happens when young people think they're invincible and ignore their body's basic needs." As if responding to his words, Isabella's eyes slowly opened. She blinked several times, seeming confused about her surroundings. The first thing she saw was Alexander's concerned face looking down at her, and she realized she was still resting against his chest. "What happened?" she whispered, her voice weak and confused. "You fainted during our dance," Alexander replied gently. "But you're safe now. Dr. Whitmore is here, and your parents are right beside you." Isabella tried to sit up straighter, but Alexander's arm remained firmly around her shoulders, preventing her from attempting too much too quickly. She became aware of the crowd of concerned faces surrounding her and felt a flush of embarrassment replace her confusion. "I'm so sorry," she began, but Queen Catherine immediately cut her off. "You have nothing to apologize for, my dear," the Queen said firmly. "You've been pushing yourself far too hard for weeks. Your body simply demanded the rest you've been refusing to give it." King Ferdinand, who had been quietly dispersing the crowd of curious onlookers, returned to kneel beside his family. His expression was a mixture of concern for his daughter and gratitude toward the young prince who had prevented what could have been a serious injury. "Prince Alexander," he said formally, "our family is deeply grateful for your quick action tonight. You may very well have saved our daughter from serious harm. Alexander shook his head modestly. Any gentleman would have done the same, Your Majesty. I'm simply glad I was in the right place at the right time. Dr. Whitmore finished packing his medical supplies and stood to address the royal family. Princess Isabella should be carried to her chambers immediately and put to bed. She needs at least 12 hours of uninterrupted sleep, proper meals, and several days of reduced activity. Of course, King Ferdinand agreed immediately. The banquet can continue without us. Our guests will understand that family comes first. As arrangements were made to transport Isabella to her rooms, she found herself still leaning against Prince Alexander's steady support. Despite her embarrassment about the public collapse, she felt an unexpected sense of gratitude toward him that went beyond mere politeness. "Thank you," she whispered. The words meant only for him. "For everything tonight." Alexander met her eyes with a gentle smile that transformed his entire face. "Rest now, Princess. Everything else can wait until you're feeling better." As she was carefully helped to her feet and escorted from the Great Hall, Isabella realized that the evening's events had revealed something important about Prince Alexander's character. In a world where appearances often mattered more than substance, he had shown genuine kindness and protective instincts that spoke to the man he truly was beneath his royal title. The banquet continued in their absence, but the evening's most memorable moment had already occurred when a prince caught a falling princess and proved that sometimes fairy tale moments happen in real life.